Alfonso X, King of Castile, Leon, Santiago, Murcia, and Seville, ruled over his heterogeneous kingdom from 1252 to 1284. Alfonso, known by his people as El Sabio, or the Wise, was a man of extraordinary culture, with great curiosity for the arts and sciences that the three religions of his realm, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, had accumulated until his time.
Alfonso's age, the 13th century, of course, is an extraordinary time in so many different ways. Just as one example, his contemporaries on the thrones of Europe included his father-in-law, James the Conqueror of Aragon, who created the Kingdom of Aragon to its fullest extent. His cousin is St. Louis of France, who is notable for his participation in the Crusades. And his brother-in-law is King Edward I of England, who had such an impact on the development of English law and justice.
Musicians, poets, and scientists found generous support in Alfonso's court. Even persecuted Catholic troubadours from the south of France are said to have found shelter there. Alfonso el Sabio expanded the work of the famous School of Translators of Toledo and had many books translated from Arabic and Hebrew into Castilian, creating a cultural bridge that introduced Eastern and forgotten classical philosophy, science, and literature to the rest of Western Europe.
Alfonso is also someone who was very open to all sorts of intellectual and cultural currents from all over the world. One of the things that he did was to establish what he called an estudio general, what we would call a university, in Seville.
His scientific books, such as the Lapidarios, and especially the astronomical tables, that Alfonso sponsored around 1260, were of great influence and still used in Europe at the end of the Renaissance.
Some people have called his reign a 13th century Renaissance because he was so modern in his approach that it seemed almost that he wasn't a medieval king.
Alfonso wrote detailed historical books as well as lavishly illustrated books on table games such as dice, backgammon, and chess, which were still used several centuries later. He abandoned Latin and embraced Castilian as his language for science, politics, and philosophy. His reign became an instrumental force in the creation of modern Castilian, or Spanish.
Alfonso made major contributions to the development of his kingdom in terms of law. For example, the Siete Partidas is a major code of law. It's unique in Western Europe as a complete code of law for any European country. It's the basis of the legal system in Spain and in the Spanish-speaking world today.
Of all of Alfonso's works, none was more dear or personal to him than the codices of the Cantigas de Santa Maria, or Canticles of the Holy Mary. The Cantigas are a collection of over 400 miracles attributed to the Virgin Mary, with the narration of each miracle set to poetry with musical notations. 4 manuscripts of the Cantigas have survived to our times. 2 mostly contain the notation of their poetry and music. The other 2 also include lavish and detailed illustrations of each individual song. 6 panels, sometimes 12, illustrate each miracle in a way similar to a contemporary comic book. The Cantigas are one of the most comprehensive monuments of medieval art, a multimedia compendium of medieval poetry, music, illustration, popular culture, and history.
Many authorities believe that the Cantigas is contributive to our knowledge of the medieval world, as the great Cathedral of Chartres in France or the famous Bayeux tapestry of the 11th and 12th centuries.
The stories of the Cantigas take place not only in Spain, but also all over Europe as well as North Africa and the Middle East. They narrate the lives of peasants, soldiers, scholars, artists, merchants, slaves, and kings. From prostitutes, gamblers, and thieves to doctors, innkeepers, and shepherds. From nuns and monks to rabbis and Muslim kings, they document with extraordinary detail the multiracial, multicultural subjects of Alfonso's kingdom. The realism of the illustrations and variety of places and people that the Cantigas portray makes this a unique documentation of daily life in 13th century Spain.
We move from every aspect of city and rural life on land and sea, and the activities of people as they traveled and went on pilgrimages, or hunted, or fished, and or lived and made love, sometimes in bed and very graphically.
Women are characters in approximately 50%, women beyond the Virgin, of course. This is unprecedented. Most medieval works do not have a good deal of female protagonists to study. And what is particularly interesting is that you find women in all sorts of occupations.
Some of the stories found in the Cantigas are part of the folklore and traditions of Western Europe, such as the story of a young German man who one day while playing ball promised himself to the Virgin Mary. When he placed his ring on the statue, the fingers of her hand closed around it. Years later, the boy, having forgotten his promise, married a young woman. The Virgin finally persuades the bridegroom to abandon his new wife and ultimately become a hermit. But the Virgin also helps couples to fulfill their sexual desires, such as the story of Cantiga 135, where, after a series of mishaps, adventures, and even previous marriages, the Virgin reunites a couple, and as the Cantiga says, after they feasted, the bridegroom did as a man does with his bride when they take their pleasure. The Virgin of the Cantigas forgives all kinds of sins and blasphemies as long as there is sincere repentance. She goes as far as forgiving incest, as in Cantiga 17, where we are told that in Rome a mother took comfort with her son, got pregnant, and killed a newborn baby.
Mary fulfills various roles in the Catholic tradition. She certainly fulfills all these roles in the Cantiga. She's seen as Queen of Heaven. This is probably, I think, most evident in the Loures, where the songs of praise which appear in the collection, she appears seated on a throne, oftentimes holding court in heaven, as a reflection of earthly courts, of course. She's also seen as the mother of God. She's thought of as daughter of Christ, and therefore a child of God, as we all are. She was also seen as spouse of Christ. In Cantiga 30 especially, she is indeed embracing Christ, represented as a young man, the Virgin represented as a young woman, and there's absolutely no difference between any other amorous embrace that you might see between people in other cantigas.
Several cantigas tell stories of nuns who tryst with lovers and, after repentance, are ultimately forgiven. Cantiga 7, for example.
Santa Maria Mar, davemus mihi ruga, grassa, grassa mugna, sobre nos purga errar, non nos amas lintacar, tudemus en vergogna. Astunza poi sentender, furam estu isale, overum grammadisa, Apurcais non suffer, che radam malazer, aviam imaisa, il forum accusat, a obispo du lugar, il venga culombia, jagou i poi chamar, aveis Deus indagar, nedanguir visogna, Santa Maria.
The Virgin had performed another of her miracles. She put the abbess into a deep sleep, took the child from her womb, and gave the baby to a hermit, allowing the abbess to undress in front of the bishop and show him that she was not pregnant. Lustful acts, violence, gambling, brutal assassinations, torture, and a whole catalog of vicious behaviors from libertine young men to cruel thieves are graphically portrayed in the Cantigas de Santa Maria. But ultimately, justice always prevails through the intervention of the Holy Virgin. Cantiga 175, for example, tells the story of a German pilgrim and his son, who, on their way to Santiago de Compostela, stopped in Toulouse in southern France. There, a wicked innkeeper hides a silver cup in the son's sack. The following morning, they are stopped on the road by soldiers. The missing cup is found in the son's bag. He is accused of thievery and is sentenced to the gallows. At that moment, the Virgin intervenes, saves his life by holding up his feet, and asks the father to continue his pilgrimage to Santiago. Months later, when the father returns to Toulouse, he finds his son still alive. The wicked innkeeper is discovered by the miracle and sentenced to die in fire. Armies, battles, and city sieges are often portrayed in the Cantigas. From a Muslim siege of Constantinople to Christians besieged in a Spanish castle, to naval battles, to the historic Battle of San Esteban de Gormaz between the armies of the Muslim general Almanzor and Garcia Fernandez, Count of Castillo. Some of these illustrations document for the first time medieval instruments of war, such as the famous trabuquet of Cantiga 28. Alfonso himself, as well as members of his family, are often portrayed in the Cantigas. His mother, Beatriz of Swabia, and the birth of Alfonso's sister, Berenguela, are the subject of Cantiga 122. In Cantiga 142, while Alfonso is hunting with a falcon by the river Inares, a bird falls into the water. One of Alfonso's assistants jumps into the river to save the bird but is unable to swim in the turbulent waters. Instantly, the Virgin performs a miracle in the presence of Alfonso by saving the drowning man. There are no more personal cantigas than 209, where we are told that the king himself felt ill in the city of Vitoria. When his doctors believed that he was going to die, Alfonso ordered that the manuscript of the cantigas be brought to his bed and placed on his chest, where he was immediately liberated from the pain, and his health rapidly improved. The stories of the Cantigas also give an inside view, sometimes historical, of the complex politics of Alfonso's regime. In Cantiga 169, Alfonso was portrayed first as a prince and later as a king, discussing with the Muslim leaders of Murcia the removal of a Christian church from the city's Muslim neighborhood. Although the request is granted by Alfonso, as well as by the Catalan king James I, the Moorish king intervenes and prevents the destruction and removal of the church. This cantiga reminds us that the Holy Virgin not only participates in Christian matters, but also in Moorish affairs, as in Cantiga 181, where the Virgin helps the Moorish king of Marrakesh to defeat in battle the Sultan of Fez, Abu Yusuf, one of Alfonso's worst enemies.
Alfonso might even be called, as I perhaps wrongly called him, but I like to call him that, a medieval folklorist. Because when he heard of a miracle, which was in oral tradition, which I would consider a part of folklore, he either sent someone to the site of that miracle to find out about it and write about it, bring it back to him, or in some cases he even took time off from his busy schedule to go to that particular shrine and get the information about the miracle himself.
I believe that there is an intimate connection between Alfonso's political and intellectual activities, a connection that is often taken very lightly by some historians of his reign. In essence, the ideological model proposed by Alfonso X, as articulated in Alphonsine law, history, astrology, and even poetry, embodied principles of universality and cultural synthesis. If we regard the Cantigas as an integral part of this organic and well-thought-out reorganization of reality, it becomes clear that the miracles of the collection were much more than devotional tales.
From this point of view, the Cantigas become an integral part of Alfonso's political model. The collection is then not only religious works of art, but also an expression of Alfonso's effort in the political and cultural restructuralization of his realm.
He came to power in the middle of the 13th century, just after the conquest of Seville and Cordoba by his father, Fernando III. So one of the tasks he had to contend with then was how to incorporate those territories, and especially incorporate the thousands of Muslims who were still living there into his dominions.
Muslims and Jews played a very important role in Alfonso's courts and inner circle. He hired them as musicians, poets, translators, and scientists. Judah ben Mosca, Alfonso's personal physician, was Jewish. So were many more of his collaborators. His legal treatise established very specific rules for the social behavior of Jews and Muslims, but it is known that these laws were not strictly enforced during Alfonso's time. Several testimonies written by collaborators of his are full of evidence of Alfonso's positive attitude toward Jews and Muslims. Meanwhile, the Cantigas are filled with insulting and inflammatory racist statements against both religions, especially against the Jews. Did Alfonso X have a double standard vis-a-vis the Jewish and Muslim population of his kingdom?
Although Jewish communities grew and prospered under Christian rule in Spain, achieving a great level of autonomy unheard of in the rest of Europe, their very success became a source of conflict. Because Jews were customarily appointed as tax collectors by the kings of Castile, and the monarchy was overtaxing the townspeople, hostility towards Jews was on the increase. In view of these circumstances, Alfonso had no other choice than to adopt a popular stand and ostensibly what he thought was the common people's worldview, a worldview that was essentially xenophobic.
Of the 427 Cantigas, 30 deal with Jews. Cantiga 34, for instance, tells us of a Jew from Constantinople. The Cantiga continues explaining how after the Jew's death, a pious Christian cleaned and saved the image. The political and economic dimensions of the Cantigas can also be found in other recurrent themes of the collection. The frequent mention of the Virgin's sanctuary of Salas, for example, is understood by many scholars as a strategy aiming at the thousands of pilgrims all over Europe who every year made their way to the famous Santiago de Compostela sanctuary. Some Cantigas go as far as implying that miracles that could not be performed in Santiago were accomplished by the Virgin in her sanctuary. Some think that Alfonso wanted to change the pilgrims' route to attract them towards the Salas sanctuary, because that would increase Alfonso's tight control over Castile's imports and exports, a control very much criticized by the nobility and merchants of his kingdom. Another example of political subtext which can be found in the narrative of the Cantigas are the over 24 miracles located at the puerto or harbor of Santa Maria in southern Spain.
Alfonso's concern was to develop Puerto de Santa Maria as a naval base adjacent to Cadiz, a base from which he could launch an invasion of North Africa, a crusade in North Africa. For that reason, he developed these 24 Cantigas that recount the miracles that were wrought by the Virgin Mary in Puerto de Santa Maria. And they tell stories about all kinds of people who came there, stories about Catalans and Genoese and people from France and elsewhere visiting Puerto de Santa Maria. So he's really trying to present this as a kind of international place, a place where people from all over the world will be welcome, where, for example, Jews may come to trade freely.
In juxtaposition to the Cantigas, where politics and economy are a strong subtext of the narration, many stories of the collection are in fact illustrations of Alfonso's deep spirituality, such as Cantiga 103, where we are told of the experience of a monk who asked Mary to show him the reward enjoyed by those who are in paradise. When the monk wakes from his mystical vision and goes back to the monastery, he realizes that over 300 years have passed by while he was listening to the birds singing. From the point of view of art and representation, many scholars agree that the Cantigas de Santa Maria are a masterpiece of European Middle Age art. The depiction of landscape, urban and rural alike, include a rudimentary form of perspective, which, with added attention to secular life, places the illustrations of the Cantigas at the avant-garde of Renaissance art. In its delicate illustrations, we can already identify a new style of pictorial representation that came with the Renaissance, a style that the great Italian painter Giotto would establish in the early 1300s, over 20 years after the production of the Cantigas. Art itself is sometimes the subject of some Cantigas. In number 9, for example, a monk is asked to purchase a painting of the Holy Virgin in Jerusalem. After several adventures, the monk is finally able to return to the woman's town near Damascus and bring the painting, which, the story says, starts pouring oil. Another remarkable cantiga involving art is number 74, where we learn that the devil appears to a painter and asks him to stop representing him so hideously compared with the way he paints the Virgin. The painter responds, "I do this to you with reason, for you will always do evil and never have anything to do with good." A few days later, the devil knocks down the scaffolding where the painter works, hoping to cause his death. But the Virgin makes the painter's brush stick to the ceiling of the church. The painter hangs on, saving his life by this miracle. Most scholars believe that Alfonso wrote many of the Cantigas, an opinion confirmed by several Cantigas written in the first person. As for the illustrations, it is believed that Alfonso hired a number of artists for its production. The Spanish scholar José Guerrero Lovillo believes that he has identified at least 3 anonymous artists through a careful study of what he thinks are 3 different manners and techniques of depicting the human body and face. What we do know is that the manuscripts of the Cantigas were illustrated through an organized division of labor. Through a study and comparison of the unfinished second volume of the Cantigas, known as the Florentine manuscript, and the finished one in El Escorial's library, we can trace some of the stages of production of a medieval manuscript. First, apprentices probably were given the task of drawing and painting the friezes and the frames. Others may have been allowed to sketch some of the general landscape scenes. The better artists drew the first bare charcoal sketches, which were then finished by the painters. Hands and faces were probably left for the most talented painters. At the end, the calligraphers set down the captions of each panel. The codices of the Cantigas not only include poetry and narration of the stories and miracles with their lavish illustrations, but also the musical notations for each song. These were fully deciphered and transcribed in the 1930s by the Catalan musicologist Higini Angles.
Angles was really the first to produce a notation, a transcription of all the Cantigas melodies, which made available for the first time the Cantigas as a musical source for performance. Musically speaking, the codices of the Cantigas are important because not only do they register the melodies of 13th century Spain, the secular melodies, they also depict the musical instruments that were used at the Spanish courts.
The Cantigas de Santa Maria are just one of Alfonso's many works of art and science. In the midst of the multiple social and political problems that he suffered during his reign, from the constant threat of Muslim invasion, to the revolt of the Castilian nobility, to the Pope's antagonism toward his pan-European ambitions, to his exile in Seville, Alfonso el Sabio never ceased protecting and financing the production of art and scientific work.
With this school of helpers and scientists and artists and calligraphers and so on, he had an enormous amount of people working for him, and probably at great expense. He was blamed, in fact, for spending too much money on the arts and the sciences than on government and military events. And one historian of later times said that he looked at the stars and his feet stumbled as he walked on the earth.
Alfonso X, El Sabio, died in Seville in 1284. Alfonso's vision had been as ambitious as his commitment to culture generous. His legacy is enormous and multi-layered. Over 7 centuries after his death, his code of law can still be found in the roots of the legal systems of several states in the United States of America. The literary and scientific works he had translated or written have shaped the culture of the Western world forever. And the language that he helped so much to develop is spoken today by over 300 million people. Alfonso Sobriquet, the Wise or the Learned, is perhaps one of the most deserved titles ever given to a monarch.